thank you all for your attention, and now we'll turn to you for comments, questions. We got started a little bit late, so I'm going to allow for about 30 minutes here of questions, answers, discussion, so we can get some feedback and dialogue. I understand if people had to slip out around 11, but we'll go on a little bit longer to try to accommodate the interest here. So we'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and I'll have people from the panel respond. Please be succinct in your comment or question, and identify yourself and your affiliation when you speak. All right, so we'll start in the back, and then we'll come up here.
My name is Ansaru. I'm Executive Director of African Center and Justice Network. My question is directed to I want to first thank the panel for their excellent presentation. Just information, 2 very quick questions, one directed to you and the next to the moderator. Given you had 2 presentations, my question is, what do you think of the FTO status here that we give to Boko Haram, foreign terrorist organization, given all your background and trying to focus on the internal dynamic? The second question is, when you talk of extrajudicial killing of leaders, which is true in what has happened in Nigeria, how do you think that would affect this FTO status and the possibility that we might send drones to strike some of those leaders? How is that helping the process? And finally, is thanks for pointing out that we need to pay attention to groups in the embryonic state. So the question of assistance and education that was mentioned by both of you, how can we do that to help stop those groups from emerging? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. You've raised a number of points that we'd like to do with. Okay, come up here, please.
Yes, I'm calling the Fund for Peace. We've had some commentary on the foreign influences, particularly the ideological, and you were talking about kind of, it's a strange, it's almost painting a picture of foreign influence. My question is, how much do we really know about foreign influence currently? Where does it come from? Is it in the form of funds? Is it in the form of actual leadership of the cells that are operating in Nigeria?
Okay, super. All right, and then there was a third question here.
I wondered if you could recall, how is your organization regarded by local government and beyond local government, national government, and have you had any backlash from experiences?
Okay, and then Ambassador Bellamy.
I'm Mark Bellamy, an alumnus of my question is concerns reports that vigilante or militia groups are forming to combat Boko Haram. And is that true? Is that worrisome? And what does that say, if true, about levels of local support for Boko Haram, either from politicians, local politicians, or from communities?
Okay, thank you. We'll stop there and let the panel respond. We'll go in the order that we spoke. Don't feel obliged to answer every question. Just address those issues where you think you can add some additional insight here, and then we'll get through.
Well, thank you very much for the question regarding the status of Boko Haram. I've been pondering of the symbolic and financial strategic relevance of declaring Boko Haram as a terrorist organization. Internally, of course, one could define them as a terrorist organization. My only concern is an organization so fluid as Boko Haram would be very difficult to really trace, to even understand their internal dynamics. My most recent reading even suggests that their leadership is unknown. So it is important for us to place them in a category where we can check any aspect of external financing or internal financing that is coming to them. So I think as far as that aspect is concerned, it probably will be helpful. I only hope that the Nigerian security system would be so efficient as to be able to identify if there is any external or internal financing about this organization, although I doubt if they have any external link at all. My most recent reading suggests that even though one of their leaders said they went to Somalia for training, and there's no evidence about this particular trip. I think that they will be making a lot of statements in order to gain attention. However, describing them as, placing them on the list of terrorist organizations, I don't think it's a bad thing. It has a symbolic value. And anticipatory, maybe that would frighten any other group that might consider integrating them. But their local nature is undeniable, and they are also very fluid. I mean, this is an organization that can disintegrate in one day. This is also an organization that has the potentials to grow. So I think to answer your question equivocally, that's the way I will place it. The financial constraint is important. The symbolic aspect is also important. The financial constraint, of course, ties into strategic manipulation of this group. External support about these organizations. I think there are people who would probably be able to answer the questions about external support concerning these organizations than I can. My research does not give me any idea, does not suggest that these organizations are sponsored by foreign organizations. They could. Many of the Salafi Wahhabi movements tapped into external resources, but they use these resources not for military purposes, but for building schools and madrasa, and indeed also enhancing their own prestige and reputations within the societies. But the new groups that are emerging, I have limited knowledge on their external aspects.
Yes, good questions. On the foreign terrorist organization, I've argued against designation. I've argued against this. Let me just give you a kind of a quick quip here. This time last year, I was in Sokoto talking with the Sultan of Sokoto, who's the nominal head of all of the 85 million Muslims in Nigeria. And after a very long conversation, he said, switching to English, "Whatever you do, tell the Americans do not designate Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization." And I pondered that ever since. And I think my reading, and I've known the Sultan and his predecessors over the years, is that there are lots of unintended consequences to this sort of thing. I've given you a quip. Abu Shakal says, "Okay, we're going to take it to the Americans now." That's not really the main problem. The main problem is that Abuja does not know the answer to the question of who are Boko Haram. It's an external ascription of anything and everything. It's not what they call themselves, and there are lots of factions within it. The policy that we've had up until November of this year was to put a bounty, with all due respect to Malik, don't kill the leaders, put a bounty on the heads of the leaders. And the strategy behind that was quite obviously to try to separate leaders from whatever passive support, the various components of that passive support that were there. Now we have lumped everyone in together. We don't know who they are in a highly charged political environment where people are going to say, if I may argue with you that Izala is part of that group and so forth. I don't believe for a minute Izala has anything to do with.
No, absolutely.
I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but there are people who make that connection.
Yes.
Salafi, Group A is Salafi Group B, and they're all this or they're all that. We just don't know what we're getting into, and that's where I think probably the U.S. Congress, and I watched the 3-hour stream of the presentations there. It was quite clear that Congress people were saying, "Who are these people?" And no one had an answer. That should be a red flag to us. And if you think for a minute that they're using the New York banking system to get their stuff around, then you just don't understand what's going on with these fluid borders. Pauline's question about external the question is, do those borders matter? What is external? House of Fulani stretch from Senegal over to Sudan, how do you try to close those borders, and then you have unintended consequences there as well. So probably as a symbolic gesture, and I know the Nigerian government has been pressing for this, the U.S. Congress, but I would be very careful how you try to implement this sort of thing. Because the tendency is going to be for the Nigerian military to say, okay, now we can ask the Americans for helicopters, and we'll go for the hardware stuff, and we won't worry too much about the software stuff. The software stuff is crucial, and that's really what we ought to be focusing on, along with how do we reform the military, because they were not designed to do this kind of domestic work. We don't do it in this country. And so forth. The question about the civilian JTF, I think is critical. There are, if you watch the VOA News this week, 25,000 young men in Maiduguri in uniform being kind of drill trained and being paid to be the eyes and the ears and the first line of resistance to Boko Haram. Why? Because the security services and the military don't know who they are. You move people around; they're in different language zones. It's just an obvious indicator that when you have to then rely on local militias. Now, I don't think anyone in this room would doubt that once you create militias, it's hard to control them. So this year they may be, but those are the same hungry young men who are now getting a few bucks to go chasing. They're extremely vulnerable. They have been ambushed. They have been killed. There's going to be backlash. Again, and who is doing that? It's the state government of Bornu. Why? Because the feds can't do it. Now that's the tension that we need to somehow come to grips with here. So I think I'll leave it at that. The unintended consequences of FTO we haven't begun to see. It's just happening, but it will likely put some wind in the sails, depending on what happens in the 2015 election. If the North is cut out once again from participation in that, you're going to see a larger group being pulled in.
Okay, Alex.
I think I better pass on the question about FTO. Although I'll note that it's not a mechanism that triggers sending drones, or it's not a mechanism that triggers any military action or military presence by the U.S. government in Nigeria. On the question of assistance in education in areas where there might be embryonic movements, I think initiatives like Mr. Sadipo's are wonderful. I mean, I think that it's important to try and have grassroots-based organizations that promote a message of peace and tolerance. There's a lot of debate, and there's more reporting about Quranic schools, and people have pointed to Quranic schools in northern Nigeria as maybe part of the problem or part of the base of institutions that might provide recruits for Boko Haram. I think that, first of all, I think it's important to avoid demonizing those institutions. I think that a lot of West African Muslims, and there's a book coming out by Butch Ware. Usman and I heard a long presentation about Butch Ware's book coming out about Quranic schools in Senegal. That really shows how many Muslims in West Africa regard these institutions as critical to the formation of good people and good humans. I think it's important to avoid demonizing those schools. I would also note that, again, if one goes back to the British documents, that the British, were thinking a century ago very hard about how to domesticate those schools and did not succeed. And I I think that attempts to domesticate those schools are going to be very complicated and maybe likely to prove unsuccessful. Although there have been initiatives in Kano State and in Sokoto and elsewhere with establishing sort of model Quranic schools that would teach trades and so forth too. And some of those initiatives seem promising. On the question of foreign influences, Human Rights Watch has said that Mohammed Yusuf spent some time in Saudi Arabia. To my understanding is the same as Professor Kobo's, that he had a Western sort of secular education. He doesn't, to my knowledge, he never held any degree from a Saudi university or anything like that. In fact, some of the Salafis who spoke out against him had been trained in Saudi Arabia and so forth. So I think that it's worth looking at that question with a lot of nuance. Obviously, there's a perennial debate about Boko Haram and AQIM. I think a lot of analysts agree that there's some degree of connection. Certainly, they've referred to each other in statements, and the debate, I guess, is about how much connection there is, and you find people all along the spectrum on that question. I would note only on that even if one could say that Boko Haram and AQIM were tightly linked, I'm not sure analytically that would do us much good in terms of predicting what Boko Haram is going to do, because Boko Haram has carried out all kinds of attacks that AQIM never has. I mean, AQIM, to my knowledge, has never attacked cell phone towers, has never committed arson of schools, has never committed drive-by shootings from the backs of motorcycles. Boko Haram shows this tactical ability to just do trial and error again and again, constantly come up with new kinds of attacks and things that AQIM really has never done. AQIM's range of attacks is more limited. On the question of vigilantes, I agree with what Professor Payton said. Definitely there are. Definitely the civilian JTF is Joint Task Force is a major force. They've been credited. There was a really positive piece in the New York Times a couple of months ago crediting the civilian JTF with restoring security in Maiduguri and so forth. I think those claims have been undermined especially by the attack on December 2nd. And I think that, as Professor Payton said, there's a lot that could go wrong in creating militias. There was an incident this fall where some civilian Joint Task Force members were sort of racing down the highway, and they had a Boko Haram suspect in the car, and a policeman stopped them, and the civilian JTF sort of said, you have to get out of the way. And I think they ended up killing the policeman in the incident. So I mean, things like that point to some of the problematic nature of creating a militia like that.
Michael.
Yeah. In response to the question of the relationship between our group and the government or other stakeholders, we have a very cordial relationship with the government and with the other youth groups in our communities. Indeed, majority of our participants are drawn from the youth department, from the government youth department. We give them almost 70% opportunity to give us participants for programs like our youth programs. So we have a very good working relationship with the government, and for now, no any backlash, we have a very good working relationship.
Okay, we'll have could I just add a footnote on the links? I think we haven't talked about Ansaru, but they're on the foreign terrorist organization list as well. They very clearly are not the Bornu faction. They're more the Sokoto Caliphal faction, and they probably do have links with the North Africans there. I mean, I would forget about Somalia, but the Ansaru broke over this issue that the Boko Haram were killing Muslims, and the Ansaru are kind of well known for kidnapping Westerners and then ransom and that sort of thing. So to make that distinction, on the education of Quranic schools, Ilm schools, the Ministry of Education in Nigeria did a 2010 report that thick on every Quranic school in the country, who the teachers were, where the funding comes from. It's a recipe to kind of take it to the next step now, and DFID is doing that, and I dare say probably USAID will be doing it at some point too. You cannot ignore 10 to 12 million kids who are not getting, their kind of standard dose of the kind of knowledge that we expect them if they're going to interact productively. So those of you interested in education, I would suggest having a look at that and then following it, because there's a lot going on in that education field right now.
Okay, we have time for just one more round of questions. And we'll try to keep it brief as we can. Be looking for people on the sides. I don't want to all draw from the middle, but please go ahead.
Lawrence Freeman, I'm directly advocate for the living in Nigeria. This is 1988, President Hiker next to John. But the question is, over sound of the letter,
Yeah.
seems to, I guess it's calling for Johnson to step down and not run, and focus on Washington, who are also doing the same thing. They're trying to get Johnson not to run. Now, is that because Johnson could be such a weak leader that he can't control Boko Haram, or just because they think Boko Haram is really out to get good luck Johnson get him out of office? Because you right now have a situation in Nigeria, from what you're painting, but I think that was the government can't move. I mean, you have police people attack in major city in Maiduguri, and you can't respond to it, then you don't have governability. So we're looking at a position where the country could be moving back to Nigeria has a rich history of. So how do we approach the situation with the current government that's exactly looking at the problem? Isn't the problem really a lack of economic development? Private transactions, bring water to the Lake Chad Basin, that has changed everything. All kinds of projects for energy and transportation. Isn't that it's killing us in southern and northern Nigeria? So hopefully
Okay, in the back, and then here. Yeah.
My name is Andy Jones. I'm from Nigeria, and I schooled in the northern part of Nigeria, Jos, and I did my medical in Kaduna. The problem I see with the Boko Haram situation is that it was not tackled when it first started. They let it grow. We have very porous borders, Chad, Cameroon, and all these countries that need to be fortified. It's a very, very important thing that needs to be done, because most of these terrorists, I understand, come into Nigeria, into the northern part of Nigeria, to commit this atrocity, and then seek safe havens in these countries. That's one. Two, closing down the Quranic school is not a good idea, because I think having lived with Muslims, I'm from a Bible, I can understand how they see things. When you do that, you anger them the more. They get very, very upset. Also, the Boko Haram situation has different tentacles coming from everywhere. And it has grown out of proportion. And we need the international community to come in and help us. Jonathan cannot do it alone. We have to accept the fact that Boko Haram is turning into communal Al-Qaeda. And the sooner we realize that, the better for us. If Nigeria goes down, the rest of the African countries will go down.
Okay.
That's a good one.
Thank you. Right here.
My name is Michael Klein. I'm an analyst with Firm Security Risk Consultancy. Although we naturally speak of organizations monolithically, we discuss the level of factionalization is quite high, not just in terms of leadership, but motivation as well. Recently, some Western journalists were interviewing prisoners in Maiduguri who painted a picture of, at least in the cells where they were located, of an almost nihilist organization devoid of religion and ideology, where Islam was never invoked and they never saw their leaders pray. Could this pose a different angle? What would it mean in terms of root causes, or particularly prospects for resolution?
Okay, back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael. Here is actually almost at the same place. But what you discover in here, let me just correct just one impression. One of the panelists mentioned that he has stopped reading any news from Nigeria. He was just looking at from Nigeria in the last this millennium. Unfortunately, if an intellectual can come up with this thing and say that, of course, everybody will agree with you that the good thing that we are talking about Nigeria in the last 15 years is because we have civilian government. This is the first time we're having this kind of long-term civilian rule. This is where you can see the best thing can happen. And then you see that there's some Nigerian boys, they don't really interact with the southern people. So I think again that the richest person in Africa today. This of religion, like University pointed out. We now have Boko Haram, the chronic Boko Haram, political Boko Haram, religious Boko Haram.
That's true.
And then in different places like that. So it's a complex issue and it's new to Nigeria. And that is why you have this kind of reaction by the military. And of course, because of the situation, they are now being retrained to be able to respond properly.
Okay. As you might have heard the sound, for those of you who came in late, please make sure your cell phones are off, not just the ringtones, because it's going to interfere with our sound system here. We're going to have one final question here, and then we'll turn it to the panel and wrap up.
My name is Olajide Jadare. I'm the president of MESMO Inc., retired U.S. Army Major, born, raised in Nigeria, went through a Muslim elementary school, and have been an observer of Nigerian situation and Boko Haram from afar in the U.S. However, the genesis of Nigerian problem, as I see it, and I will throw it to the panel, to take a look at exploring the fundamentals of people calling themselves a nation without a language and moving far away from their culture. The dependency that is manifesting itself in so many problems that are unsolvable in Nigeria today is because of that lack of identity. They have no roots to hold back to go back to. One of the panelists talked about critical thinking. Growing up in Nigeria, started learning English language at age 10. Basically, if you consider the critical thinking, how you develop critical thinking, you will find out that those languages are important. Your main language, mother tongue language. And from observations across Europe, 3.5 million people in Fyrom speak their language. And they love their country because they are attached to that language and culture. Nigerian situation is different. Since independence, they've become more dependent on foreign culture. So in Nigeria today, you could assess that Nigerians are foreign to themselves. So Boko Haram coming out and doing all the things they're doing, and the government having no clue how they emancipated, how they evolved, is a question that we need to try to look into the aspect of and the factor of running away from their own culture and their own language, dependent on English. And 20% of Nigerians cannot boast that they actually understand the English language that they use officially. And so, sorry for the long comment. So my question is, what do you all see as educators, the panelists, what do you all see as, do you see a factor of that English, of that language and cultural dissociation from the national society of Nigeria?
Okay, thank you very much for putting that on the table. We'll go in reverse order now and respond to the questions that you want to, or if you have something to add to, and any final comment or remark that you'd like to make.
Yes, well, looking at the responding to the question of the issue of identity and issue of language and critical thinking. In Nigeria, I know very well, just what you said is correct, it's true. And that's why we're having all these issues that we're having, because we tend not to have a common, just as I've said in my presentation, that we don't have that common unit, that focus of oneness to tackle our issues. But they are based on where we come from, and not that national unity. And that's one of the things that we do in our own programs, that we tend to bring young people from various backgrounds together and to see, not to deny the fact that we are different, but to see that, yes, to see how we can tap into our differences and to see how we can make them strong for us and to live a better life. Bringing the people, the young people together from various backgrounds and to appreciate their differences and to see how they can channel it for national development through peace education, civic education, and even entrepreneurship. We also train them on how to become self-reliant, like the youth, the out of schools youth that we work with. We also bring people who are entrepreneurs to talk to them and to see how they can teach them how to work with their hands and not to depend on either their leaders or so-called godfather that we have in Nigeria. But I think this is what we do, and it may take time, but it will work. It will surely work. Because, as I've said, Nigerians, we know how to tackle our issues, and we know how to do our things, which I know very well. We will surely come over it. This issue, this event, this thing will not bring Nigeria down. I have that very strong conviction that Nigeria will come out very strong. Very strong.
Thank you. Alex?
Just to respond, Ms. Jones? Yeah. So I agree with you about border control. I think it's extremely important, and I know there have been initiatives between Nigeria and Niger and Nigeria and Cameroon to try and have joint border patrols and things like that. I think it's extremely important. On the Quranic schools, just to be clear, I think they're a tremendously important religious and cultural institution in northern Nigeria, and I think anyone advocating that they should be closed down is off base. And I think that some of the initiatives that governments have undertaken over time to try and reform them or to try and boost them and things like that, I think some of those have shown promise. I guess what I was trying to underscore with my comment is just that governments have been trying to do that for a long time, and I think it'll be a very difficult task to try and domesticate those schools. In terms of the nihilism of Boko Haram or the religious factor, I guess listening to Yusuf, it seems pretty clear to me that Yusuf was delivering religious discourses and doing that within a recognizably sort of Salafi framework. With Shekau, the religious element sometimes seems to be less present. I mean, sometimes it seems to be real sort of political, diatribes, and the religious element isn't as present. So I think there's a case to be made for that nihilism. At the same time, they definitely have continued to target rival religious figures. They've assassinated rival Salafi clerics in the northeast. They've targeted some of the traditional rulers, and then they've targeted Christians, and I think that they've tried to inflame, either by staging attacks or sometimes, to my mind, claiming attacks, maybe in Jos or elsewhere that they didn't necessarily carry out, but claiming attacks in an attempt to inflame interreligious tension. So I think there's still a religious element, but I do think I think that element of nihilism is interesting to think about, and that there's undoubtedly a range of views within the movement and a range of displays of piety. So,
Usman, I'll let you speak, and then I'll let John finish.
Okay. Well, let me begin with the Quranic schools. I have done extensive research on Quranic schools, and I have a chapter of Quranic schools in Ghana and Burkina Faso in my book. I think anyone who considers eradicating Quranic schools will be involved in a futile action. It just would not work, because Quranic schools are central to Muslims' religious identity and spirituality. And Quranic schools have their value. The question of lumping all Quranic schools into one basket and dismissing them as sources of fanaticism, I think, is completely absurd. It's not true anywhere, not even in the places where these studies have been made. There are a few Quranic schools that could serve as sources of recruiting people, but I think it is extremely dangerous to generalize. Something that is going on with Quranic schools, and I know this true in Ghana, Togo, Benin, Burkina Faso. My studies are focused on Ghana and Burkina Faso, is the transformation of a number of Quranic schools into Anglo-Arabic schools or Franco-Arabic schools. And this is to provide Muslims with a religiously acceptable avenue of education. So Muslim kids could go to those schools, and those schools represent secondary schools. They get their Quranic education. They also get their secular education. And that has been very helpful. And I know that's also the case in Nigeria, because one of the earliest symbols or models of this was actually in Lagos. I'm trying to remember, Markaz al-Islam, Islamia, was actually in Lagos. I think it was first founded in Surulere in the, I think, 1956 or 1957. And that provided a model, in fact, for Ghana, where one of the students in that school actually returned to Ghana and established this kind of Anglo-Arabic Quranic schools. With the comment that I made, it's unfortunate comment, but it came out of personal frustration. It's nothing to denigrate Nigeria. I've always held Nigeria. I've always equated Africa's or West Africa's success with Nigeria. Nigeria succeeds, West Africa will succeed because of its sheer size. Even when one looks at Islam in the entire Africa, Nigeria has more Muslims than Egypt. Egypt has 74 million Muslims. Nigeria has between 79 and 80 million. Nigeria also has many more Muslims than most of the countries in the Middle East. This is something that is not emphasized, and I have statistics about this that I use in my class. So the statement that there isn't much news coming from Nigeria has to do with my own personal frustration. But I still do read the news. In fact, I read the news this morning. I listened to BBC. So I apologize if that offended anyone. By the way, for those of us who are unaware, there's almost always a rivalry between Nigeria and Ghana, and sometimes that I didn't mean to be part of that rivalry at all. The other issue, the interaction of Muslims and Christian youths, which I was referring to, I was basing it on my own personal experience. And the argument, the statement I made was something that I included in my proposal, that Muslims in the North and Christians in other parts where Muslims and Christians don't really interact. This kind of interaction opens one's mind the same way it opened my mind. Now, in Nigeria, the problem with Nigeria is one cannot generalize anything. You take Yorubas, for example. You look at Yoruba, southwestern Nigeria. Yorubas are practically, I don't have the statistics, but from my personal experience and knowledge of interacting with Yorubas in Ghana and Nigeria, they are almost 50-50. I mean, you have 50% Muslims and 50% Christians. Yorubas tend to be more flexible when it comes to issues of religious identity than Igbos, at least from my personal experience, and than Hausas, at least from my personal experience. But let's also not forget, until the Civil War, there were a large number of southern Nigerians in northern Nigeria, correct, who interacted, who lived, coexisted with Muslims without any problems until the Civil War. So the issue is we cannot overgeneralize. However, in northern Nigerian youths who are, and that is also true for some southern Nigerian youths who don't get to interact with Muslims or non-Muslims, tend to base their behavior on stereotypes. And that is the argument I'm making. We need to move beyond stereotypes to really interacting and knowing that people have lives, that people are not really so much concerned about religious differences. And that is very true, and that is eye-opening. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to elaborate. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Usman.
It's always good to hear a Ghanaian say good things about Nigeria. Although when you started out with the problem with Nigeria, etc. Let me quickly just go through the questions with some comments. Lawrence on the Obasanjo letter to Jonathan. I don't think he's asking him to step down. I think he's asking him not to run in 2015, partly because he had made a commitment, and this is elaborated the last time around, to only do the 6-year stint rather than the 10-year stint. And I think Obasanjo also is one of these people who is aware of the dynamics around the country, and as part of the military has a nationalist perspective. The U.S. policy is, I can't speak for it, but from my just observation of it, isn't to tell someone tell Nigerians what to do. On the other hand, I think it's enormously important not to become overly dependent on incumbents. There's a tendency to kind of do that. We now have the beginnings of a two-party system in Nigeria. I think it's important to say, let the process evolve. At the same time, I think it's important to do what we will be doing, and that is to bring northern governors over here and to begin to reestablish relations. You cannot imagine a Nigeria, understanding Nigeria with its complications, when you have no-go zones up in the north. The embassy doesn't know what's going on up there, and we need to reestablish those connections and get things normalized. I think that would be the essence of U.S. policy. My own view is that, well, you can guess what my view is. I think if Jonathan runs again, it's going to be a real problem. Amelia's comments about the borders and Alex's kind of reinforcement of this border question, the counter argument there is Nigeria is, and as part of a top priority foreign policy, a member of ECOWAS. Everyone knows that. Which gives you a different view of borders. And the model there is really the European Union, the Schengen group, where you get people moving around, the free flow, and so forth. So that was the model. So what do you do now? Okay, Cameroon, Chad are not part of ECOWAS, but you'd have the Lake Chad agreements there. So you have, in that West Africa desire not to just get stuck at the nation-state level, you want regionalism to emerge. And of course, you've also got treaty obligations under the UNHCR with refugees. You have to let them back in. You have to let more are going out, but then they are allowed to come in. So it's a complicated issue, but it's not just as simple as, well, we'll close the borders and that will send a message that there's foreign stuff coming in. It's just not that simple, as everyone knows. On the Michael's point about the prisoners in Maiduguri, Islam not being invoked. Yeah, I think we've seen those interviews, and they're very interesting. What they say, what they don't say, which is why we kind of started out, and I think our mandate here was to deal with drivers. There are economic drivers, there are political drivers, there are ecological, demographic, cultural and religious drivers. And so if you took a population of young kids who are being pulled into this, you're going to find different motivations. Some of them will have still the rallying cry of a religious identity sort of thing, and that identity I think can't be wished away, regardless of which brand of the Islamic spectrum there are. And 99% of Nigerian Muslims are very moderate. So don't. On the rich poor, okay, we all agree on that. Military is not being responsive appropriately. I would suggest those of you who are in the military and dealing with counterparts to the national commissions and so forth, pay attention to the National Defense Academy in Kaduna, pay attention to the National Defense College in Abuja, pay attention to NIBS in Kuru, and so forth. Work with the counterparts of the people, because these are where the reforms are going to come that we all know are needed to deal with the problems of this heavy-handed, ill-equipped, it isn't just a matter of more training, it's a matter of redesigning a military for domestic, for backup. And of course, backup that means also reforming the police. And again, these militias are just, are an indication that it's not working at present. I like the question on Nigerian ID and English language. I have to say, I started out by saying I'm really interested in the whole question of national unity in Nigeria, and so many of these things relate to it. Some of you who know me know that I've dedicated the last 3 books I've written to the unity of Nigeria. I make no bones that this is something that I think is in the best interests of not only Nigerians but the world at large. How do you build national unity? And the question of this English language as not being the mother is really important, particularly in the North. Let's just assume there are, 70 million people who speak Hausa either as a second, third, or first language. How can you imagine training up a whole generation of people requiring them to be bilingual before, this wouldn't work in China, it wouldn't work in Japan, it wouldn't work in France. You have to begin to rethink the national unity imperative. And I've talked to the people who are education is what we in the universities do, so this is really an important issue. And this sort of one-size-fits-all in terms of English language and centralized curriculum. For those of you who are interested in federalism, it's the absolute opposite of federalism that we would be familiar with over here, where you allow more flexibility at the state and at local level, and figure out different strategies for transitioning people in. Eventually, you want a country that can talk to each other. But the idea that you have to start them off in the early stages, English only kind of thing, is a recipe for the problems that we've been talking about here today. And again, this is the larger question in my mind of how you promote national unity with all of this. In my view, Nigeria's got to be the most complex country in the world. I think we agree on that. Given all of the components, but and we can all think of a dozen ways in which it could break down. What we want to do is to not just deal with a symptom here and a symptom there, but you need to work in the Nigerian counterinsurgency narratives, which some of you may have seen. They call it an all-of-country approach. We call it maybe an all-of-government approach. They're calling it an all-of-country approach. That's where I think we want to really focus our attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John, and all the panelists. A number of people had written before our session that they weren't able to make it, and I know those of you here probably have colleagues who would have liked to have been here. Our hope is to have a video of the event up on the ACSS website starting next week if there aren't any technical difficulties. And so we may send an announcement about that, but if not, please check back and feel free to disseminate the link to others who care about this issue. Before breaking, I just want to thank you, the audience, for your patience and graciousness and great questions, engagement. It has been a very rich session, as we had hoped. I want to thank my ACSS colleagues who helped put this event on, especially Davin O'Regan, but also Ilias and Margot Shori, Antoine, Wendy, and others who have contributed. So thank you for your efforts. And then finally, I want to thank the panelists. You've done everything I'd asked you for, and kept to the time. It was the moderator who lost track of the time there a little bit, but it really was as rich as I had hoped it would be. And my only regret is that we didn't allot more time to really go further into this. But if you'd all join me in just thanking the panelists for their work. And I know several of you have other questions. I think the panelists will be here for a little bit if you want to wander down and ask them in private. Thank you again.